Hey, so I just finished recording and for a future episode of the Illusion of Consent with Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, and there's something on my mind that I really wanted to just kind of get out there as well. And while I've got this set up, I figured why not? What I want to talk about is this idea of when, or like what is the declaration fight? What does that really mean in a time like we're in now, or when we've got a apparently creeping sort of sense of you know, both being unmoored and also having lost the ground between, you know, beneath our feet, and also feeling that something is being either taken or destroyed or mocked, etc., etc. So I want to tell you guys a story about the most disturbing thing I ever saw as a child in Romania. I used to go back and forth from America to Romania to visit my grandmother and my uncle and my cousin and my aunt. And my mother would always make sure that we were staying somewhere that, you know, was as comfortable as possible for, you know, for me. And so it was always a very, you know, I never saw the worst of the worst in many ways. I mean, I always had, you know, I would see suddenly there would be, you know, run out of food at this beautiful restaurant in a park, but, you know, I never saw, my mother protected me, but my grandmother's apartment was in Bucharest, and I used to go regularly, so there was a playground nearby, and I used to be able to go by myself and go play with the kids there, and I would, you know, see them year after year after year and recognize people, kind of like going to summer camp, I guess. And at the time I spoke Romanian, because I grew up, you know, my grandmother didn't speak English. She spoke only Romanian and Hungarian. We chose to speak Hungarian and Romanian in the house with her because my father was never going to learn Hungarian. But Romanian being a Romance language, so it was something that I was very comfortable with. Never learned to write it, though, and not really read it either. But this playground was someplace I really loved to go. Like, I loved playgrounds. And I get there, and I remember being really shocked by what I saw. So let me try to explain it to you. The playground itself was covered with debris, some from I assume from this construction site that was nearby. And it was a lot of, you know, 2x4s and nails and debris and stuff like that, but nothing so bad that a few people working together wouldn't be able to pick it and clean it up. But kids and a few adults were just standing around the playground, not moving, like, at all, just standing there, like, staring at the playground and the debris. And I remember wondering why nobody was cleaning it up. And, you know, because I was a kid, I kind of assumed that something was wrong with me. You know, as strange as that sounds, that these kids suddenly just didn't want to play with me, or that I did something wrong. And I remember looking, and I said, you know, fii atent, you know, come on, pay attention. Let's you know, let's clean this up. We can do this. You know, make it a game. Anything can be a game when you're a kid. And no one moved. Again, nobody budged, and they were just looking. This, like, expression that I can't. If you've never seen that expression, I mean, the only time I never imagined I would ever see it in America, and I did in New York. But it's a very strange expression. It's like, you know, if Adam Smith has the invisible hand that, you know, has a part to play in all of our lives. It's like the dark side of that. Something was stopping them, and I didn't know what it was. And I kept insisting, and this one mom looks at me and she says, just 2 words, she just looks at me, and there's this look in her eyes, because I kept trying to get her kids, and I could see this look, like this American girl, like, showing this initiative, and eventually she just has this look, and it was this combination of pity and shame and anger and grief all at once, and she just said "nu pot," which means it wasn't just that we can't, it was also we mustn't. And I didn't know why. And I remember walking away from there and being so shaken by it that there used to be these women used to walk around and for recycling bottles and would say, Stiklagala Kumpa, like buying glasses. And, I picked up one of my skirts and pretended to be one of those girls, as I walked into my parents, my grandmother's apartment to see my family and just said, Stiklagala Kumpa. Like I wanted to just bring some light into the moment. And it was only years later that I learned what it was, and that what it was that they could have been accused of some organized event or taking a job from somebody else or, but the reality was I don't even think anybody knew why anymore. And censorship works in a similar way. My mother always said that there's nothing worse than censorship, not because of censoring itself, but what it does to you. In China, they call this killing the chicken to scare the monkey. James Lindsay oftentimes refers to this as the action is the reaction, or that it's never about, the action is always revolution. Here's another moment. I remember that I'm in the car with my uncle, and he was the sweetest man. And we're going to visit my dying grandmother in Bucharest. And I'd been in cars with him before, but suddenly at every red light, he would stop the car and then turn off the engine. And I was a kid, I just said, like, DJ, why? Why are you doing this? And at first he didn't answer me. And I kept saying, like, why are you doing that? And he just turns and he has this expression. And maybe this is partly the difference between a male and a female reaction to these circumstances. He just is so exasperated, and he says it's like a mile a minute, and his voice is raised, which I never heard. He was like, there is no reason. It's not good for the car. It's not good for the gas. It doesn't save gas. It doesn't do it. It doesn't do it. But we have to do it. We just have to. We have no choice. Just like that. And I'm just like, it made no sense. Like, what could be going on that would scare somebody so much? Václav Havel, in this amazing Esquire piece written in 94, says, never hope against hope. And see, when Trump put his fist up in the air and said, fight, he could have been saying, hope. Like, saying, keep hoping. Like, don't give, like, it's don't give in. If you're watching, like, remember the movie Never Ending Story, don't give in to the, like Artak, don't give in to the nothing. Don't give in to the sadness. Because history is redefined under these systems. It's no longer something that every person in the human lineage played a part in making. It's suddenly something that happens to us, that we have no part in, that we have no part to play, that you can't influence, that you can't change. And every single depiction that we've seen in the last few weeks, particularly since we saw that moment, and I don't care whether you like Trump or don't like Trump, what was an amazing thing about that moment was that we watched as whether or not something was an inside job or a failure or tactical, that they had obviously, listen, whether Trump dodged a bullet or was wounded or died, there was a reason that action was done. And they were going to be prepared to respond to it. What no one expected, I think, was the way a man, an individual, a human being, responded without thinking in a moment that was just true. Nobody could fabricate that. In all of this artifice and all of this BS and all of these lies, and amongst all the lies, we suddenly saw something that was true. When you see something true, it can offer a chance to reorient your spirit towards hope and then fight or take action or do something. Václav says that hope is not the same thing as optimism. It's not the same thing as doing something because you know how it's going to turn out. It's not putting in an investment because you know it's going to have success. Hope comes from doing something not because you know you're going to pull it off, but because it's something that should be done, or it's true. It's not result-oriented the same way that, frankly, liberation theology is. Liberation theology and Silk Realism is all about purpose. It's all about this promised, assured, glorious future. That's the entire philosophy. It's all based on that. That's one of the differences. Like, so when we say that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and they are endowed by their creator certain unalienable rights. Unalienable. Can't, no one can be alienated from anything. And they are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's not the happiness, it's the pursuit. I mean, the American dream is not the happiness. The American dream is the act of dreaming, having the liberty to be able to pursue, to dream, to take action, to do something, to not be frozen in a sense of hopelessness and only making choices because you know whether it's going to turn out right or not. We are inspired by our heroes. What makes a hero? I'm not talking about a specific individual, but what qualities make somebody heroic. See, in Silk Realism, which is the philosophy and the cornerstone of what we're all dealing with, it's not just an aesthetic. It's how they function. It's how they operate. It's how they do all of their. It's essentially it's like the mechanics or the traffic signals in a seemingly chaotic order, but how they communicate with one another, and no one really. It's a myth to think that somebody suddenly out there, you get rid of one person, that suddenly the regime ends. See, that's a huge lie. Going back to Romania, this mythology, for example, that when Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife were shot, that somehow this was a sign that the people had, risen up and in their uprising had managed to topple a dictator. These systems are not dictatorships. They're not. See, Nicolae was not afraid of the people. Nicolae suddenly knew that the system would see to it that he would be removed because he was of no use. If he couldn't control the people, he's had no use. So the Securitate took over. That's what happened in that moment. And the people who had started the uprising against, Soviets along with everyone else, they, once in the system, many of them were removed, whether, having heart attacks or, and it's because this system itself, this system that's almost like, it's almost as if it's almost like a spell that's cast amongst, like creating something out of nothing, meaning that, as Václav says, is that rather than power serving the people or ideology or theory serving power begins to serve theory or ideology. It's like as if power had created power from power. He says that the declaration of the empty phrase is what allows those who would use empty phrases to become embedded in this system and like cogs in the wheel, but none of them have any real power. Because once they're in it, if they do anything that's in a opposition to it, it will just push them out. So a moment of truth is about something even more than the individual, and it's a break in the illusion, right? That we're right now we're watching where he calls it a dictatorship of the ritual. So this ritualized motion that we all know, we know they're lying, they know we know they're lying, they know we know they're lying, but still they lie. Why do they lie? Because the system demands it. Because everything is created under false pretense. Everything, from statistics to history to future to biology, all of it. And in moments, though, like these last few weeks, where we see this strange dichotomy between what's true and what's not. So, like, we saw a man act heroically and show what we believe sort of through our human experience of thousands and thousands of years of what makes a man heroic. The way women responded, the way men responded. It's true. Meanwhile, everybody trying to tell us that what, say, for example, Biden did was heroic. Meanwhile, that's not only not true, what's really true is that this man was treated abysmally. He was just tossed out. He became much like many of us were treated during COVID. It doesn't make it okay. And then, of course, the system itself, what's it going to do? It's going to take anything that happens and try to make it serve itself. So what we saw as an individual suddenly is now all about party. Partynost. Partynost and party spirit is something that is, when it gets overwhelming, it will make you not move in a playground when you can. That's Partynost. This specter that is everywhere. And this is why the truth that, for example, the woman boxer from Italy is a woman, and she obviously the person who has maybe the genitals that appear, they call it intersex, but you know how we define that now is all a mess. But the reality is that other long-term, long-running institutions that would be in place to protect sport and the integrity of it declared that this person couldn't fight a woman because it would be far too dangerous. And it goes from, you know, a ritual that is, even with all the risk of any athlete, you know, if anybody who's ever, you know, my mother was a trapeze artist. There's always a risk in athleticism, especially with that level of dedication and commitment and that higher level, that certain regulations get put into place because the purpose of the Olympics is not simply to have a few people win an award. I mean, it's become the Oscars. The purpose of the Olympics is to inspire the viewer to believe that a single individual can become extraordinary and do something extraordinary. But when it becomes something else, the goal is to annihilate the individual completely. That's why nobody could move in that playground, when play became something that was unthinkable. And it took time, but suddenly, you know, I'm not even sure anybody knew why. It's like there are now people who don't even know why they are defending whether or not somebody who, we all saw a man hit a woman. And we heard a woman afraid for her life to choose to live over win an award. She, in that moment, was just, it's true, she was saying, fight. L'chaim, live. She had to live. Because that was not the game that she was trained to play. So it wasn't. She knew it intuitively, instinctively. With all of her training, she just knew it. All other chatter is just chatter. The other, you know, other than that, I mean, what names can I name from the Olympics? I couldn't name any of these other athletes. These stories that we're being told by media, the ones, it's very disturbing. But I'll tell you this much too: there's a really disturbing element that's happening with how people are discussing the opening ceremony. Or before I do that, I've heard some people that I respect a great deal say that she should never have been willing to fight that there's no respect for somebody who does that. Well, hope is personal. It's an internal process. It wasn't about the result. Why did she do that? For her own dignity. That's why. For us to keep behaving now that every single thing that happens in the world is a political act, that's how they win. Because that's not true. Some things are personal. What makes something true is when you see the super personal, especially under these kind of systems. I mean, even if she was crying and there was a risk, but the way she was talking about how she did this for her father, tell me, who do you think feels more fulfilled as a human being right now? Her, despite her grief, or one of those performers from that opening? With as much, how proud they claim to be. I mean, in French, there's 2 words for pride, but see, you can be proud of your hard work, or pride cometh before the fall. So we can choose to look at these things in either the narrative that Silk realism demands of us, or we can look at them in what's true. She's a hero. Because she showed us something we all needed to see, so now we can make a decision. Men, you have a choice. Are you going to allow this to continue because you are insistent that you don't want to be flung out of the system? Do you agree with the very people who have been saying this for so long, that all of these institutions need to be burned to the ground so that it can start up again? I mean, that's Liberation Theology 101. Same thing they've all said. Because something's inevitable. And there's no guarantee. But in the grand scope of things, we can never know what happens when you lose. I mean, I, for one, it's a pretty big mindfuck. If my grandfather had not ended up in the Gulag and then in Pitești and survived, I wouldn't be here. It's humbling. So to say that she should not have done that, that's not our place to say. It's really not. She didn't do anything based on something that was immoral or even amoral. She's an athlete. That's what they do. She's a boxer. Her purpose is not a utility for someone else. She worked her whole life for this. Donald Trump, in that moment, showed something also beyond himself. Fight. So what are we fighting for? And when do we fight? And when do we not fight? Do we only fight because it's going to either serve a political purpose or serve a promised assurance of something that is being predicated on either biblical prophecy or political prophecy? Because let me tell you, as somebody who's a Jew, when we say that there's one story we tell every year, doesn't matter how religious you are, one story, more than our high holy days, more than anything else. And that's the story of Passover, which is the story of Exodus, which is the story of the end of our enslavement for Pharaoh. It is the story of freedom. That's the story we tell. And we tell it every year because it changes every year. You learn something new every year that you tell it. Who's around that table? Who you're telling it to. In fact, part of our Haggadah is even like directions on how you're supposed to tell the story to different kinds of people. There's the wicked son, the wise son, the dim son. And sure, there's variations on this. And there's some that unfortunately over time have become... Let me put it like this. If every story has certain parts, right? Every story has the writer, the narrator, the characters, and ultimately the story. So if we use that structure, right? So the story of The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci, he painted, so he's telling a story. He is writing or painting a story, which is the painting of the Last Supper with these characters in the story. And what are they doing? It was a Passover Seder. They're there to celebrate, remember, retell, but not so much celebrate. It's not really celebrate. It's every year on the lunar calendar, go back to the time that this happened and remember it and never forget how it happened. What were the circumstances? And there was a lot of, it wasn't all beds, It wasn't all, eureka. You remember the suffering that had to happen. And you remember most of all that prior to that moment, freedom as a concept, it didn't even exist. It's much like how in the mythology of the Greek mythology of the Muses, without memory, which is their mother, none of the Muses would exist. And those Muses are not like, whispering in your ear like, hey, here's a storyline. A Muse is like, without Talia, there is no comedy. So without an understanding of what that depiction of that was, whether it was the Last Supper or a retelling of a Dionysian feast, because that was one particular way of telling it, which is very Hellenistic. And there's a story about the same people who came through Exodus battling against Hellenism to make sure that their wisdom survived. And in that story, the Maccabees are fighting their own. It's not some external force in that story. And it's debatable about what it was about Hellenism, but my thinking is that the danger that comes when we don't understand what story we're really telling, or who's telling, or what the essence of the story actually is, or the motivations of the writer or the teller, is that it's a form of enslavement. You become a slave to artifice. And everyone does, not just the viewer, but the storytellers too. I mean, and then all of the frantic activity around it can serve as a distraction, because meanwhile, while everyone is waiting and so worried about what these imageries and these images, what possible, bad juju could happen, or, what will God do to punish? Reality is taking place right under our noses, and we're so caught up that we don't even see it. Like, these illusions suddenly become more important than the reality itself, which is exactly what Václav describes. And this feeling of powerlessness, this feeling of an inevitability. Women and men are different. That female fighter, she went in the ring. She didn't refuse to fight a man, not because, that's a political statement. She went in the ring because that's what she does. Doesn't matter who the opponent is. She's a fighter. And women, we know a little bit about that level of kind of submitting to what nature has kind of placed in front of us in a way that men don't understand. If women were so afraid of the result of pain, none of us would be here. If we were so result-oriented, of win or lose, none of us would be here. There is a very real, chaotic, unknown that can lead to a lot of different things, but this idea that we can control every opponent that comes our way, women, we know that is not true in any way. And men, your frustration with us when we put ourselves in harm's way makes sense too. It makes sense that men are angry, that women are taking such recklessness with their lives and bodies. But that's what women do. Sometimes it's absolutely careless and it's terrible, but when we start to look at it through a lens of politics, then suddenly we're not even seeing the people who are actually causing the harm anymore. Who's the real one to blame here? It's like, we can look at all the performers, for example, or I dare say even on October 7th, watching what men were doing to people, or in 2016 looking at what monsters we created monsters like Harvey Weinstein, or what they were doing, but here's the problem. That's such a childish way of looking at reality, because we all know that even in every Western or every hero story, it's not so simple. I mean, who's the monster? Is the monster or the hidden monster that delivers the monster its prey? Like, who's the monster here? And is the monster actually an individual? Right now we're dealing with a monster that's and I like it's an automaton. We're all like battling windmills. So I keep asking, what stories are we telling and what stories are we being told? The Olympics has a power to it because it's a ritual. And there's unfortunately so much that's been lost. I mean, I was using this book a moment ago for the conversation I was having, and even words like transformation have changed in meaning, because it's like when you're looking at liberation theology, you can't use the same words. Like if I say to you communion and I'm not a Christian or a Catholic, it means something entirely different in a secular world. It also means something else different in a political world. We're all being sort of subsumed by this illusion, which it actually becomes more powerful than reality itself. And it's tricky. I mean, we saw it happen with COVID. I've even heard people calling this gaslighting. It's not gaslighting, because nobody's actually lying to you. People see this as reality because their reality is worshiping purpose, just the way you say somebody who is a believer, true believer in Christianity will say that everything that's happening right now is based on what's the unfolding of the end of days. But if you ask somebody who reads Torah about it, they'll give you a very different answer. So what story are we telling? And I'll say again, to use an analogy or a metaphor, don't you think Lucifer would read scripture? Now, I'm saying this as somebody who I don't really think of the power of Lucifer, but as a metaphor. So to think that, in horror movies, we have all these metaphors, whether it's the Blob, we have, Frankenstein's monster, we have Battlestar Galactica, we've got all these stories about this mechanized world and what starts to happen. But everybody looking for, aha, that's exactly what this is. Which, by the way, we got kind of trained into doing during COVID, I think. But is it working? I mean, and if it's not, is that because the enemy is just so great? And there's enough stories out there that tells us that's not true. We used to know that it could just be one man standing alone. He's the most powerful man in the world. That came from words of Ibsen, but also from Torah and Greek mythology and Welsh mythology. This is part of who we are as human beings. But ritual transformation can basically be used as a dark art. Yeah, it's a spiritual battle, but what does that mean? So if you really think that there's a spiritual battle going on, then don't you think that, much like if you're going out, for men, I'd say this, if you're going out into the world and suddenly you see that you've got an opponent, you have to size them up, right? Can I hit this guy or not? Like, what's going to happen? And you make an assessment. You make a really quick call. Women, whether when we're browsing and looking at her, or men when the idea of the hunt, like all these things, there's ways we make assessments, not just immediate reactions. And for what? To be right? See, that's the thing too. This is a religion in which their consistency is what matters. Whether they're right or wrong is up for debate. What isn't up for debate is they're consistent. And that march toward communism has led to the most horrid enormities ever. But it's not that these people are evil. It's just we seem to not be willing to just do everything we can to not blame the people, but just stop this runaway train. It's not practical. I think that there's a lot of people out there who, in their pursuit of understanding this one system, they get so stuck in the system that they don't understand its essence anymore. Or the essence that we were trying to preserve. Like, what are we wanting to save? What are we fighting for? I mean, if they've got a pretty good, easy way of just convincing these empty slogans and they really believe what they're fighting for, what are we fighting for? If we don't know, we're going to lose. And I would dare say that the sanctity of the individual is one thing worth fighting for. But we've become so sort of detached from sort of our natures, and social sciences have lost what it was they were trying to do about explaining the world. This is the same thing that happened with art, and we keep trying to use their own methodology of deconstruction to label it. It's all Soquelism. It's all of it. The hero is toil. The toiler is unthinkable outside the collective. Morality is dictated by Partenios, by party. The spirit of party is in all of us. We were warned about it at our founding. Now we're following along and believing that it has to be a Republican or a Democrat win, because that's what the Republican and the Democrat Party tells us, because that's Partenios too. And when all more concerned about whether our candidate wins or loses, but that's really whether the party wins or loses. And we seem to have forgotten what just happened, because it doesn't matter. It's not a fair fight. So what are we fighting for? We're not in a fair fight. Period. We know that already. It's already done. So what are we fighting for? It's not fair. It's not ethical. Well, what are the clues on how to preserve and keep what we value? In addition to documents I've read before, there's so much out there that gives us clues, but most of these are stories and legends and mythology and symbols. And our focus on this identity politics crap that basically suddenly makes us convinced that the only way to battle against something is one form of a messianic story. And that suddenly people will react and say, oh, it's all about belief. But again, systems exist in order oftentimes just to preserve it. So for Christians out there, or people who are seeking, or former atheists, almost everyone I know has suddenly said there's more than. So there's finding your way to what is true. There's a lot of stories of what happens when people suddenly begin to have a relationship to God. But I'll tell you one thing. The Exodus story isn't a liberation story. It's not. We tell the story over and over again to remember it. That we are born free. You're born. Nobody has to liberate us. But we didn't know that once. That 40 years wandering in the desert wasn't because we didn't have a map. It's because we just didn't open our eyes. Or rather, they were open, but we were so afraid, understandably afraid. But it was in the moment when we chose to trust that this God that we decided to partner up with wasn't like the ones before. Maybe, one way to look at it. We're so traumatized just having to believe. But more than having belief, having trust. A very more human relationship than most people are comfortable with. The mythology of Greek mythology and how it's incorporated into so many other stories, including elements of Torah and elements of the New Testament as well. That has a value. But which version are we being told? the Temple of Dionysus and Dionysian, that's not just this carnival of debauchery. That's not what that is. It's not. Any more than that depiction of the Last Supper was just some meal. It's not. The literalism is a variation on essentially a golden calf. It's a false idol. And I would dare say that faiths like mine, where we wrestle with God a lot because we don't have any image to lean on. We don't. Part of our relationship is that we just keep choosing, sometimes despite knowing whether or not it's going to go well. We keep fighting for that relationship, much like a marriage or a principle or a country or a nation or any of these things. We do it not because we know with certainty it'll turn out well, but it's because we made a commitment. We said we would. We keep doing that, but we choose to do it over and over. We were chosen, and then we choose. Chosen and choose over and over and over again. Like that fighter, she was chosen or chose to get in that ring over and over again, and then she was chosen for the Olympics, and she chose to get in the ring again. That was extraordinary. And then she chose to say this isn't right and stop it. And now we're talking about it. Imagine if she hadn't. So I would really say, I caution everybody who thinks that we know exactly what's happening, that somehow it's, whether you want to call it satanic or you want to call it this or that. All of these labels, it's something unknowable. But that doesn't mean we have no choices, or that we're not free, or that they have all the power. And most of all, those who like to manipulate things, remember, putting people into a choice dilemma. We're all in the ultimate choice dilemma right now. Our country, America, shouldn't be so concerned about who gets into the executive office. And if we actually started to realize what's obvious, we should be more worried of what if our candidate gets in, but he has no ability to work in any sphere, to do anything. Because it's in that hidden sphere, it's outside the systems themselves where something happens. That's where, I guess you could even use the analogy, we all have to pass through that desert in order to know our natural state. And I think a more accurate description of what we're actually dealing with and what was so troubling in the whole transformation ideology is that it is an attack on identity itself. That's what identity politics is. And once your identity is attacked, then the goal of sequelialism, which is to annihilate the individual, whether they can or can't, doesn't matter. They try. And it's a form of torture. It's awful. And there's a pain that happens when we see it happen. Like watching an old man who would, whether you liked him or not, be discarded without even the farewell address. That's part of our ritual. To have our country be something worth beyond ourselves that's meaningful. Like men often knows what that's like. I don't think purpose is the accurate word for it. I think and legacy is a much more accurate word for it. Or, life. Women, we do too. And this stuff is just counter to that. So look out more, I think, for the anti-human elements and the dehumanizing elements and the mechanized elements that seem to turn everything into some dancing nurses thing, right? Bad artifice, bad art. Eugene Ionescu also said it's far more dangerous to be a mediocre critic than a mediocre writer. And in a world where there's very little creating and a lot of critiquing, all I can say is please, please, please think about the danger in there, because we are all liable to be captured by hubris. And hubris can sometimes allow us to win a battle, and this is to ladies out there, when we are captured by hubris, we can destroy the world. So, yeah, fun times. I'm gonna leave you with, I've actually never actually read this portion before of this book that I've had since college, so let's see what it says. It goes, The Function and Transformation of Ritual Killing. Now, this book, by the way, comes from this is before the Wokies fully invaded social sciences. And so, this is by Walter Burkett, facts of publication. Walter Burkett, 1983, The Function and Transformation of Ritual Killing. In Homo Nakens, The Anthropology of Ancient Greek Sacrificial Ritual and Myth. Walter Burkett believes that ritual sacrifice developed among ancient hunters. As males banded together for killing, sacrificial rituals performed in preparation for the hunt established primal social structures. Their collective aggression required social organization. In addition, humans experienced the sacredness of life in the act of killing. Killing nourished and gave power to those who caused death. Sacrifice is transformative, says Burkert. Though the experience of the sacrificial death, men were made conscious of a new order, a new beginning. They thus reasoned sacrifices appropriately accompanying any creation, such as erecting a building. Taking an evolutionary perspective, Burkert considers the development of agriculture, asking what happened to the sacrificial killing of animals that was so common among earlier hunting societies. Though it underwent transformation, it survived in sacrificial acts performed during harvest celebrations. It also survived in secret societies in which initiates were ritually killed as sacrificial victims. Burkett finds in the ritual of ancient Greece all the attributes of sacrificial ritual. He sees war and capital punishment in more contemporary societies as continuations of the sacrificial heritage. This was written, the author was 1931 was when they were born, and at the time that this was written, they were still alive. And he says, hunting behavior became established, and at the same time transferable through ritualization. In this way, it was perceived long after the time of the primitive hunter. This cannot be explained simply by the psychological mechanisms of imitation and imprinting, whereby customs are inherited. These rituals were indispensable because of the particular thing they accomplished. The only prehistoric and historic groups obviously able to assert themselves were those held together by the ritual power to kill. The earliest male societies banded together for collective killing in the hunt. Through solidarity and cooperative organization, and by establishing an inviolable order, the sacrificial ritual gave society its form. As ethology has shown, a sense of community arises from collective aggression. A smile can, of course, establish contact, and a crying child touches our hearts. But in all human societies, seriousness takes precedence over friendliness and compassion. A community bound by oaths is united in the sacred shiver of awe and enthusiasm, the relic of an aggressive reflex that made the hairs bristle in a feeling of strength and readiness. This must then be released in an act. The sacrificial ritual provides the occasion for killing and bloodshed. Whether in Israel, Greece, or Rome, no agreement, no contact, no alliance can be made without sacrifice. And in the language of the oath, the object of aggression that is to be struck and cut becomes virtually identical with the covenant itself, Furus Ferrer. Families and guilds organize themselves into sacrificial communities, so too cities at a festival, as well as gatherings of larger political groups. The inhabitants of the Peloponnesus, the island of Pelops, meet at Pelops' grave for sacrifice at Olympia. The islanders celebrate in Delos. The Ionian cities slaughter a bull to Poseidon at Mycale. In the time of Cicero, the cities of the Latin League still had the right to demand their portion of meat, from the sacrifice of a bull to Jupiter Latarius. The Ionian League, headed by Athens, first met at Delos. Later, Athens exacted a phallus for the procession at the Dionysia at Athens, and a cow for the Panathenaea. It is in this sacrificial procession that the empire's power becomes manifest. The closer the bond, the more gruesome the ritual. Those who swear an oath must touch the blood from the accompanying sacrifice and even step on the testicles of the castrated victim. They must eat the meat of the victim as well, or at least and this is in Greek, the collective term for the organs of the sacrificial animal in Greek, written in ancient Greek. It was generally believed that conspiracies practiced human sacrifice and cannibalism, and in a secularized form among Athenian heterodia, collective killing was an expression of loyalty. Here, the sacrilegium normally contained in the sacrum no longer remains within the confines of the ritual. In a sacrifice, the circle of participants is segregated from the outside world. Complicated social structures find expression in the diverse roles the participants assume in the course of the ritual, from the various beginnings through prayer, slaughter, skinning, and cutting up to roasting, and above all, distributing the meat. There is a, quote, lord of the sacrifice, who demonstrates his vitae nasci potestas, actually only a nascis potestas, but it seems e contrario to include the power of life. And as for the rest, each participant has a set function and acts according to a precisely fixed order. The sacrificial community is thus a model of society as a whole, divided according to occupation and rank. Hence, the hierarchies manifested in the ceremony are given great social importance and are taken very seriously. An ancient epic, the Thebaid, relates that Oedipus cursed his sons because he was given the wrong piece of sacrificial meat. Harmodius murdered Hipparchus and Pisistrate because his sister had been denied the honor of being a basket carrier in the Panathenaea. And the Corinthians turned against the Corinthians, not least of all because in their common festivals they would not allow them the customary privilege of founders, and at their sacrifices they did not perform the rites of beginning for a man of Corinth, as the other colonies did. This ultimately resulted in the Peloponnesian War. The sacrificial meal is particularly subject to sacred laws that regulate social interaction in distributing, giving, and taking. The very fact that eating became ceremonial clearly distinguishes human behavior from animal. Once the deadly knife has been used on the victim, intraspecific aggression must be set aside. This is accomplished through an eating inhibition evoked by rituals that excite anxiety and guilt. Since a hunting society must support women and children, abstinence becomes an excuse we killed for the sake of others. Thus, there is often a rule that the killer, the sacrificer himself, must refrain from eating. And this is not so only in human sacrifices. Hermes, the cattle killer, must also obey this rule. And similarly, the Pinari were excluded from the meal in the sacrifice at the Ara Maxima. Sometimes there is a rule that sacrificial meat must be sold at once. In this way, the ritual inhibition becomes an economic factor. The taboo make social interaction all the more intense. The shock felt in the act of killing is answered later by consolidation. Guilt is followed by reparation. Destruction by reconstruction. Its simplest manifestation is in the custom of collecting bones, of raising the skull, the horns, or the antlers, thereby establishing an order whose power resides in its contrast to what went before. In the experience of killing, one perceives the sacredness of life. It is nourished and perpetuated by death. This paradox is embodied, acted out, and generalized in the ritual. Whatever is to endure and be effective must pass through a sacrifice, which opens and reseals the abyss of annihilation. Building sacrifices, for example, are for this reason widespread. A house, a bridge, or a dam will stay strong only if something lies slaughtered beneath it. One of the most detailed Latin descriptions of a sacrifice depicts the erection of a border stone. A sacrificial animal would be slaughtered in a pit and burned together with offerings of incense, fruits, honey, and wine. The stone was then placed on top of the remains while they were still hot. Thereafter, neighbors would return regularly on the anniversary of that sacrifice to repeat it. Similarly, altars and statues can be set up over a victim in the course of a ritual. Any new creation, even the birth of music, requires ritual killing. Underlying the practical use of bone flutes, turtle shell lyres, and the timpanaton covered with cowhide is the idea that the overwhelming power of music comes from a transformation and overcoming of death. Thus, a slain man is easily made a hero, or even a god, precisely because of his horrible end. In any case, apotheosis is always preceded by death. Sacrifice transforms us, but by going through the irreversible act, we reach a new plane. Wherever a new step is taken, consciously and irrevocably, it is inevitably connected with sacrifice. Thus, when crossing frontiers or rivers, there are another Greek that I can't pronounce, ancient Greek, which means, in footnote 22, it means, for the special importance of these rituals for Spartans, at the crossing of the Hellespont, Xerxes burnt incense, poured libations, and sank valuable objects in the sea. Alexander made numerous sacrifices to the same end. Sacrifice transforms us. By going through the irreversible act, we reach a new plane. Whenever a new step is taken, consciously and irrevocably, it is inevitably connected with sacrifice. Thus, when crossing frontiers or rivers, there are, that word, when opening an assembly, there are strange purifications. When passing into a new age group or on entering an exclusive society, there will be a sacrifice. Before the sacrifice, there is a period of abstinence. And if after it new barriers are erected as a sort of reparation, their limits can give new definition to life. If it is followed by a predetermined, I think that's Leos, or lifestyle, the sacrifice becomes an initiation. Those who have undergone the unspeakable are both exonerated and consecrated, as expressed in the Greek word. On the Delphic, who were concentrated through a sacrifice performed by there was presumably a similar contrast between the egg taboo and a ritual egg swallowed among the Orphics. Thus, the new lifestyle and the sacrifice at its inception are almost complementary. Homophagi is followed by vegetarianism. Killing justifies and affirms life. It makes us conscious of the new order and brings it to power. Following Rudolf Otero, students of religion had used the following concepts to describe the experience of the holy: terror, bliss, and recognition of an absolute authority. Mysterium, tremendum, fascinans, and augustum. The most thrilling and impressive combination of these elements occurs in sacrificial ritual. The shock of the deadly blow and flowing blood, and the bodily and spiritual rapture of festive eating. The strict order surrounding the whole process. These are the sacra par excellence. Above all, the young must confront the holy again and again, so that the ancestral tradition will become their own. Although we can understand the persistence of sacrificial ritual through its social functions, this by no means excludes change as an explanation. Ritual is a pattern of action, redirected to serve for communication, and this means that the terms of expression are open to substitution, i.e., symbolization. This occurs even in the insect world, when a resourceful male offers his bride a white balloon or veil instead of an edible wedding gift. Oh, it's rituals that take place in the animal kingdom, like barrow birds giving their mate stuff with a barrow. Every communication is symbolic in as much as it does not use the real object it wants to communicate, but substitutes a sign that is familiar to and hence understood by the addressee. The object serving as sign is exchangeable. If the sender and the receiver are sufficiently familiar with one another, the complex of signs can be greatly reduced. On the other hand, when in competition with rival communications, the sign is exaggerated and heightened. Substitute signs thus used, whether consisting of natural or artificial objects, pictures, cries, or words, may be called symbols in a pregnant sense. They are not chosen arbitrarily, but are taken from a continuous tradition. They are neither independent nor self-evident, but bound to the system in which they function. Their richness of meaning coincides with the complex effects they produce in predetermined interactions. In ritual aggression, the ends and the means of aggression are exchangeable. Even mammals tear up tufts of grass or shred tree bark when performing the threatening rituals that both introduce and postpone a fight. The triumphant cries of the gray-legged goose are directed toward a purely imaginary interloper. In human ritual, too, the aggressive gesture can become so important that its object is unessential. The wildest form of destruction, that of tearing an object to pieces, can be carried out on an ivy plant. And instead of deadly club, a safe and flexible narthex stalk can be used. Spiritual forces thus find release in a harmless game, which heightens the sense of social order by means of dramatization. Yet the theatrical character of the ritual may become so obvious that it imperils its necessary function. In groups shaped by aggression, especially in the younger generation, forces that question the acceptance of tradition become active. Willfulness stands in the way of the impulse to imitate. Thus, along with its theatricality, human ritual must always have a strong underlying component of seriousness. And this means that time and again, there is a regression from symbolism into reality. A non-instinctive ritual transmitted by human beings can fulfill its communicatory function only if it avails itself of a pragmatism that is unquestionably real. In the hunting ritual, aggression between men was redirected toward an animal quarry, which was thereby raised to the status of personality, a blood relation, even a father. It became the object of a comedy of innocence. But because of the necessity of food, the hard underpinning of reality was never questioned. This all changed when mankind took its most important step, its mastery of the environment. In the Neolithic Revolution, the invention of agriculture some 10,000 years ago. Thereafter, hunting was basically dispensable. Characteristically, however, it was retained even in advanced cultures as a ritual status symbol. The pharaoh was celebrated as a hunter, as were his counterparts in Babylon and Nineveh. The Persian kings maintained animal parks for hunting, and Alexander followed in their footsteps. Of course, it was no longer a question of catching one's dinner, but purely a demonstration of the ruler's power to kill. Thus, the most prestigious quarry was the beast of prey. Through this emphasis, the sport remained pragmatic and serious. Heracles, the bearer of the club, was more popular as a lion killer than as the tamer of the bull. We find a transitional phase documented at Katal Hayuk, the most important religious symbol in this farming town where goat and sheep had long been domesticated was a pair of horns from the wild bull, and wall paintings containing clear, thrilling depictions of the ritual hunt of a band of leopard men. We can even trace the gradual extinction of wild cattle in Kadal Huyuk, though not the critical step that followed. In place of the dwindling bands of wild animals, domestic ones were now used for sacrifice. The power of the traditional ritual to bind thus remained intact. The animal must, of course, now be removed from the everyday world. It must become sacred. Hence the adornment and the procession, and sometimes the animal being set free and recaptured. Hence, too, the many steps of the beginning, the incense and the music, in addition to the action, which is no longer dangerous or even difficult. There are also words, prayers to the stronger powers, and myths that tell of them. The reality of death and flowing blood is an unmitigated presence, perhaps all the more intense because the reaction is now inspired by a domestic animal, a familiar member of the household. The rapture attendant on eating game in the sacrificial meal is no less real now. Moreover, the domestic animal is a possession which must be given away. Thus, in addition to the old fundamental ambivalence of life and death in the sacrifice, there is now also renunciation and gratification. Even more than before, a sacred order is presumed and confirmed in this critical situation. In any case, with the integration of animal sacrifice into agricultural society, a very stable socio-religious structure was established, which was to survive many thousands of years. No less important was the expanded symbolism brought about by the newfound sources of food from farming, barley, wheat, the fruit of the vine, and added to the themes of ritual killing. The ritual pattern was so strong and inflexible that a festival meal without the preliminary horror of death would have been no festival at all. The farmer had to be just as reliable, enduring, and farsighted as the hunter. In particular, it was no mean task to overcome the inclination to eat the seed grain rather than throw it on the ground in the mere hope that something would grow. Here, too, the individual's desire for immediate profit could be controlled by the sacred tradition of the hunting ritual, which established the old order in a new context, renunciation and abstinence for the sake of long-range success, and with it a new order. Thus, the harvest is celebrated in a hunting festival and in sacrifice. Gathering and storing at the sacred place now took on a new reality. Most importantly, the seed grain could not be touched as long as it was stored in sacred granaries, those mysterious half-buried depositories of wealth. At the same time, aggression had to look for new objects. Consequently, farming implements assumed the character of weapons. After all, a plow, a sickle, and a pestle were all used for chopping, cutting, and tearing apart. Cutting the wheat could thus become a symbolic substitute for castration. Grinding the grain and pressing the wine could take the place of tearing up an animal in the hunt or sacrifice. Plowing and sowing could be seen as preliminary sacrificial renunciations. We have already shown how, in hunting ritual, death gives way to new order of life. In agriculture, the victory of life can be felt with even greater immediacy. The vine that has been pruned will bear all the more fruit. The grain that was buried in the earth sends up new shoots toward the light. The sacrificial ritual's power to bind is preserved on this level as well. Contracts are sealed with libations of wine, and weddings are celebrated by cutting up cake or bread. Cutting or breaking must still precede eating, just as slaughtering precedes the eating of meat. The symbolism could easily be detached were it not for a counterforce guiding it back to the frightening reality. This occurs first of all in the myth, for the most gruesome tales of living creatures torn apart and of cannibalism are presented in conjunction with the achievements of civilized life. But the myth is not enough. Blood sacrifice must be made at the harvest festival and at the preparations for it. Here, the savagery beneath a seemingly civilized exterior is exercised. In Greece, as far back as we can see, the victims were animal. But in the tropics, the very regions that had more favorable climates, the planters regressed to regular human sacrificing, to cultic cannibalism. Only in this way, it was said, could the seed grow and the fruit ripen. Civilized life endures only by giving a ritual form to the brute force that still lurks in men. Thus, aggression is once again directed toward human beings. Although the male societies that had been superimposed on the female structure lost their ostensible function when the hunt was abandoned, they were reestablished among planters as secret or mask societies. At the center was the secret sacrifice, and if the aggression did not suffice, it was worked out within the society itself. The contrast between the sexes was now played up. Minderburdened versus female power. The more so because women now shouldered the main burden, supporting the family according to the new agricultural method. Likewise, the conflict between the generations became highly dramatized in the initiation rituals. Deprived of its hunting quarry, the secret society makes the initiated himself into a victim. The group's aggression becomes focused on this man, and he is forthwith killed, symbolically, of course. A sacrificial animal is substituted at the last minute. However, the bloodshed and the refined methods of torture are very real and guarantee the seriousness of the ritual. The gruesome evil at work in the ritual fulfills a function, i.e. to preserve a social structure over the course of generations. Once again, life rises up from the peril of death. Indeed, the individual experiences in himself how, after life had been endangered, there is a resurrection, a rebirth. To some extent, this too was still a game, a show. With the progressive growth of consciousness, civilization came to demand absolute seriousness. One could no longer pretend to kill men. For this reason, the death penalty became the strongest expression of governmental power, and has often been shown. The criminal's execution at a public festival corresponded to a sacrificial ritual. In ancient times, the death penalty was not so much aimed at profane murderers as those who entered an untouchable, sacred precinct, went into a house of the mysterious, consecrated, or laid a branch upon the wrong altar. The taboo almost became an excuse to find a victim for releasing the sacred impulse of aggression. There is another, far more serious way to divert aggression toward the outside world. By integrating large groups of men in a common fighting spirit or war. History, as far back as we can trace it, is the history of conquests and wars. Ever since Thucydides, historians have tried to understand the necessity of these events and, if possible, make them predictable. But it is precisely the irrational, compulsive character of this behavior mechanism that confronts us more clearly today than ever before. War is ritual, a self-portrayal and self-affirmation of male society. Male society finds stability in confronting death and defying it through a display of readiness to die and in the ecstasy of survival. Such modes of behavior are so bound up with the governmental systems and value of our society that even today, when modern military technology has made war so distant that its absurdity is patent, when it is beginning to be the source of discord rather than that of solidarity, still, final emancipation from war lies far, far in the future. For the ancient world, hunting, sacrifice, and war were symbolically interchangeable. The pharaoh and Hercules could be lord of the hunt, lord of the sacrifice, and warrior. On grave reliefs, Greek youths appeared as hunters, warriors, and athletes. The emphasis may well have varied according to the social reality. A farmer, for instance, would put more weight on sacrificial ritual, whereas the nomadic animal breeder, wary of slaughtering his own proud possessions, would become a conquering warrior. Among the Greeks, a military expedition was prepared and ended by sacrificial ritual. There was sacrifice before setting off, then adornment and crowning with wreaths before battle, all as if it were a festival. A slaughtered victim introduced the subsequent deadly action which in Homer is simply called, I don't know how to say this in ancient Greek. It looks like E-P-Y-O-V, but it's an E with an umlaut at the top. Afterward, a monument, a tropaion, was set up on the battlefield as a consecrated, enduring witness. This was followed by the solemn burial of the dead, a privilege the victor could not deny his defeated enemy. The burial, almost as important as the battle itself, was far more lasting in its consequences, for it left an enduring monument. It almost seems as though the aim of war is to gather dead warriors, just as the Aztecs waged war in order to take prisoners to use as sacrificial victims. The erected and consecrated monument is what endures, and it embodies the duty of the following generation. For war, necessary yet controlled, because it is a ritual, has this function above all. It must integrate the young into the patriotic community. The Senatus resolves, the Inventus must fight. As a rule, the Greeks, O-Pi-O-V-O with the swirling A-I, I'm sorry, I don't know ancient Greek, were a period of 30 years at most. Each generation has the right and the obligation to have its war. This is a fascinating book that I got called, and I would encourage anyone to be very cautious not to place any political meaning into that. That's just what social science once did. Observed without overly politicized or part most. The Silk Realist ritual is something else. So, I'll launch a space if folks want to talk about this. Otherwise, over and out. I will check my feed to see if anybody wants me to launch a space if they have some thoughts, but this is the book that I was just reading from, Readings in Ritual Study, Modern Crimes, published in 1996. I have not been able to see this, but there's I refer to this book probably more than any other. And I think Václav Havel was correct that the post-totalitarian system is made up of the dictator of the ritual, where the ritual does no longer serves the purpose that it was intended to over humanity's natural evolution. I think people like Gad Saad and Brett Weinstein can talk about this far better than I can, and I hope they do very much.